Welcome to our series on the Apocalypse. Today would be episode 17, and we are continuing our discussion of what would be chapter 14 in your manual, part 2, part B, as it were. We're raising the question in this chapter, are you he, or must we look for another? Those of us that are watching online and finished the last episode, at whatever convenience you are now watching, would have them in sequence. Locally and here live, we have been a break of 2 weeks between the filming of the last episode and this one. Our videographer, Richard, his uncle, had COVID-19 and has passed away. And so, Richard, we extend our deepest condolences to you and to your family. And so we come now to continue our episode 17 on chapter 14. Are you he, or must we look for another? I don't always have a chance and don't go on YouTube to catch your responses. Richard has made those available to me periodically. He will send those to me. And so for those of you watching on email that continue to make your comments, I greatly appreciate them and am encouraged by them, as well as those of you that have sent them directly to my Ezra at St. Elijah OKC .email. Account here. Are you he, or must we look for another? You see, it implies we know who we're looking for, and then once we know who we're looking for, it's a question, are you him, or will somebody else be him, this one? Two separate issues, and so we pick up where we left off. Let us now turn aside. You see, Jesus said, go tell John the Baptist what you have seen and heard. 60 years later, it has been 60 years since Jesus spoke those words when John is writing the Apocalypse. And for those 60 years, John, the apostle, has proclaimed what he had seen and heard. 1 John 1:1, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked upon and our hands have handled, concerning the word of life. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and declare to you that eternal life which was with the Father and was manifested to us, that which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things we write to you, that your joy may be full. What he had seen and heard and experienced in the presence of Jesus, John declared. John made no distinction between the words and presence of Jesus before the resurrection and the words and presence of Jesus after the resurrection. They were one and the same person. They were one and the same God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of mankind, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. You see, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness to the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every one coming into the world. The incarnate Word, the incarnate light, became flesh, became a human, and walked among them, and they did not know it. They were blind and did not see the light shining in and forth from this incarnate one. But the day did come when they saw. The day came when John the Apostle saw the light. He beheld before the resurrection his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, when he went up Mount Tabor with Peter and James. He beheld after the resurrection Jesus in the same glory he had seen in Christ before the resurrection, he now beheld in the resurrected one the glory of the only begotten of the Father. You tell John the Baptist what you have seen and heard. You tell the world what you have seen and heard. This is the message. This is the revelation of Jesus Christ. He is not a two-bit political Messiah. He is not a Messiah wannabe. This is God in the flesh. This is God before the resurrection. This is God after the resurrection. Go tell them what you have seen and heard, what you have tasted and felt and experienced. Go tell who I am. Go tell John the Baptizer what you have seen and heard and experienced in the presence of the resurrected one. Well, it raises a question, are you he or must we look for another? The difference that people make of Jesus the Messiah versus Jesus the Christ. At least since Adolf von Harnack, known in the 19th and 20th centuries as the Prince of German theological scholars, in his massive 7-volume History of Dogma, at least since then, had as its central theology in Western Europe, has had as its central thesis in its definition of dogma something they call the Hellenization of Christianity. It has long since then been an accepted belief among theological scholars that the Jewish Jesus had somehow been Hellenized into the Greek Christ. So the world today is still asking, are you he or must we look for another? And they are expecting this kind, and they now look at what they've gotten and say, you're not who we're looking for. Noted German theologian Albert Schweitzer, building on Harnack, undertook the task of explaining the evolution of thought in the first century of Christianity. How was it that Jesus of Nazareth became Jesus, the divine Christ, in that first century? Schweitzer planned to focus first on Jesus and then on Paul. Schweitzer's task ended up becoming 3 separate books. The Quest for the Historical Jesus, published in 1910, will set at the beginning, 1910, the beginning of the 20th century. This book and the thesis that Schweitzer presents will dominate Western theology and the understanding of who Jesus is for the rest of that century into this century, 21 years now into this new century. The Quest of the Historical Jesus by Schweitzer. What was originally then going to be the introductory chapter after that book into Paul grew into a book itself, just the introduction to Paul, under the title Paul and His Interpreters, which has been republished, and I have a copy here. And this just introduces the topic of all the interpretations of who Paul is. And finally then, that was in 1912, and finally, after several interruptions in his life, and eventually he goes to Africa and is a medical doctor missionary there, he will complete his mission by publishing The Mysticism of Paul, the Apostle, that will be published in 1929, that's now been recently reissued. Albert Schweitzer dominating the theological understanding of Christianity and particularly Jesus in the 20th and now the 21st century. Schweitzer's quest for this historical Jesus greatly influenced Christianity in the German and English-speaking world for more than 100 years. Harnack's thesis that the Jewish Jesus had been Hellenized into the divine Christ of Christianity became part of the scholarly creed in the 20th century, explaining how that Hellenization, the transformation of Jesus the carpenter into the divine Christ, now became the issue. But in reality, the need was to explain how the purely eschatological end-time belief had developed into the Hellenistic one. The problem of the so-called Hellenization of Christianity turns round the question of Paul. Schweitzer set out to show what that means is this: the division between the simple carpenter of Jesus, the historical Jesus, and having been Hellenized, having somehow this carpenter is turned into the divine Son of God. The belief was from Harnack that Paul did it. And so the division was between the simple message and morality of Jesus, the itinerant preacher, and Paul, who transformed the simple life of Jesus into the divine Son of God. Now, Schweitzer set out to show that it wasn't Paul, but it happened after Paul sometime. So he's disagreeing on when it happened, not that it happened. And so Schweitzer is going to say the Hellenization of Christianity does not happen with Paul, but only after him. Schweitzer's book on Pauline mysticism arrived at a time in 1929, I believe that was the date that we gave, when Protestant theology was engaged in a fierce debate over the very legitimacy of the mystical experience in the first place. That is, the experience of the presence of Christ versus a rational intellectual belief. In that debate, Schweitzer sought to disengage the thought of Paul from the Protestant Reformation of Luther and Calvin, with whom since the 16th century Paulinism had been defined and identified. So it was something that Luther and Calvin, in beginning their Protestant Reformation, had begun to define who Paul was versus who Jesus was. Mystical theology, rather than springing from Luther and Calvin, had its roots in the pseudo-Dionysius, who wrote a book titled The Mystical Theology back in the 300s. The collected works of pseudo-Dionysius describing and discussing the mystical presence of Christ and the mystical understanding and experience of God, the foundation of experiential Christianity and piety. New Testament scholars, meaning Protestant scholars of the 20th century, the 19th century, are going to reject mystical, experiential Christianity that dates back in writing to Dionysius. New Testament scholars did not, therefore, accept Schweitzer's version of Paul with that same unanimity that they had his treatment of Jesus. They love what Schweitzer said about the historical Jesus, but they didn't like the fact that Paul wasn't the bad guy. Schweitzer had argued Paul was in agreement with Jesus, and that the Hellenization of first century Christianization had begun after Paul sometime in the 2nd century. Protestant theologians of that era, the 20th century, stood with Luther and Calvin. Paul could not have been mystical. Paul could, on the other hand, being trained in Greek and Hellenistic thinking, was the beginning of Hellenization and Hellenized Christianity. In the 20th century, Protestant theologians and New Testament scholars had ratified the division between the historical Jesus of the Gospels and the Hellenized Christ of Paul's epistles. Now, you're looking at me saying, oh man, what has this got to do with me in the 21st century? You see, the 21st century and the ideas at work in our world didn't just happen overnight. They didn't just happen because the clock turned a page. We tore out the old December the 31st, and it's now January the 1st, and we're in a new year. The 20th century we're talking about is the 20th century that has defined and shaped and created the very world we're now living in. We cannot just talk about the apocalypse and everyone wondering, is it the end of the world and what is the meaning of history, and ignore history. We must look at how and what happened in the whole debate and the entire rejection of Christianity in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. We cannot blindly, like the ostrich, stick our head in the sand. Now, you may not need this information, but you know, since we have been doing these local Bible studies, and Richard has been so gracious to tape them and place them online, that by God's grace, the doing of the Spirit of God, people from all across our nation, people across this continent, and people across the globe have contacted us telling us they're watching the videos. People from all walks of life, all different religious backgrounds, all different ethnic and national backgrounds, living across the globe, around the globe, in both the northern and southern hemispheres, are responding and reacting to these seminars on the apocalypse. Everyone comes from a different experiential background and from a different intellectual and academic background. And so, unknown to us, there is a larger audience, some who may by chance, they think, stumble across us, some who have heard that the simple Jesus of Nazareth was only a simple itinerant preacher, and that someone else invented the concept of the resurrection, someone else invented the divinity of Christ, and they need an answer. If we do not speak to our world today, if we do not in hostility, but if we do not read the books, someone, and point out the error of what is there, not just in a knee-jerk fashion, but having thoughtfully seen what they're saying and balanced it with our understanding, then how can we address our world? And so we must turn aside and give consideration to who this is that we call the Christ, and who the theologians and religious scholars in our nation today, many of whom are in agreement that the historical Jesus was one person and the Christ of the rest of the New Testament was invented by Paul. We need to know that, and we need to be able to address it, and if nothing else, inside ourselves. Be not afraid of what they are saying. Be not afraid that we have believed falsely. And so we take on full face the history of how we got, how the world has gotten to where it is today. If we are to then, in the world we have today, have a word from God to say to us in that world and to everyone else in the world along with us. In the 20th century, Protestant theologians and New Testament scholars have ratified this division between Jesus, the simple carpenter, and everything else said about him. By the 21st century, Protestant theologians and New Testament scholars in this century, in this day and age, openly accuse the church fathers and the fathers of the ecumenical councils for having hijacked the historical Jesus and have Hellenized him into someone called Jesus Christ. There are pastors of churches not far from where I stand right now who have written their books for their congregation here in Oklahoma City that would declare such things. This is not a hypothetical something out there. Those who believe this argue that Hellenized Christianity is only one version or kind of the many Christianities that actually existed in the first centuries, removed from the apostolic protection of the councils. This historical Jesus that they talk about is fair game to be hijacked, to be raped and prostituted as the poster child of any would-be church or social cause in America or anywhere else. If there is no identity, then we can invent him into being our kind of Jesus. So just how Jewish was this historical Jesus in the first place? Just how Jewish, if he was the simple Jewish carpenter, let's ask that question. How Jewish was he? The Jewish understanding response to and the understanding of, the response to Jesus and the response of Jesus and the church depends upon when and during what period we ask the question. What was the Jewish response to Jesus then? What is the Jewish response to Jesus now? The history of the Jewish interaction with Christianity would end up being a separate study within itself. It certainly would be a study outside of my expertise. Some would say every study I'm doing is outside of my expertise, and I guess I would have to agree. However, a few observations are in order. Kaufman Kohler, a leading Jewish scholar and theologian, was a contemporary of Albert Schweitzer. I don't know where I put, here it is. He is a contemporary of Albert Schweitzer when Schweitzer wrote his book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus. His Jewish book, Jewish Theology, Systematically and Historically Considered, was published in 1918, shortly after Schweitzer published his book. The Jewish scholar Kaufman Kohler is going to publish his Jewish Theology. That's going to be published then and before Paul and his Interpreters gets published. It's sandwiched between them. In the 20th century, this Jewish scholar, Kaufman Kohler, joined in agreement with Protestant theological scholars in dividing Jesus from Pauline Christianity. Kohler saw Jesus as the successor to John the Baptist. This is a Jewish scholar speaking about Jesus. He saw Jesus as the successor to John the Baptist and becoming then the leader of Essene movement before John's death. And according to Kohler, the early Christian churches would never have been able to conquer the great world if they had persisted in remaining Essenes. They owed their success, according to Kohler, to the large Hellenistic groups who joined with the Essenes at an early period and introduced the Greek language as their medium of expression. So you've got that ancient group among the Jews, the Essenes, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you bring to that the Essenes, and Jesus is an Essene according to him, and now you add in Jewish Hellenism, and so they're going to use the Greek language, and that's why Christianity exploded in the empire. With his disdain, Kohler's disdain for Alexandrian Hellenistic Judaism, that it was a movement inside Judaism in Alexandria, he credits the success of the early Christian Essene Christians for having adopted the propaganda activity of Alexandrian Jews. It was the Jews in Alexandria that had opened the door for this renegade so-called Christian group to take a simple teachings of Jesus to the world. Now, this propaganda activity that Kohler speaks of included using the Greek language instead of Hebrew and making use of the Septuagint. You know, that authorized translation of the Israelite scriptures into Greek that had been begun after Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt back in 300 or so BC, the 300s, 330s, 340s, whenever it was. We've already looked at that. The creation of the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, the understanding, the translation of the ancient Israelite, what Christians call the Old Testament, into Greek. And so it was because of a Greek Bible, the Old Testament in Greek, that the Christians could evangelize the empire. The Greek language paved the way for the church to enter the great pagan world, as the Greek translation of the Bible in Alexandria brought the teaching of Judaism to the knowledge of the outside world. Now, Kohler's absolutely right about the use of the Septuagint, of course, and the use of the Greek language. It's his disdain for Greek Hellenized Judaism in Alexandria that is the total problem for him. It's the problem of those bad guys in Alexandria, he wants to tell his fellow Jews, that brought about the birth of Christianity and all the misery they've caused us. By using the tools of Hellenistic Judaism, according to Kohler, the simple Essene Christianity of Jesus began attracting large groups of Hellenistic Gentiles as converts. You see, so if Jesus and Paul and a divide has happened, Kohler is going to say that division was caused by Hellenistic Jews in Alexandria. He's just saying when or where the divide happened. At this point, the time was ripe for a bold and radical innovation, and at this psychological moment, according to Kohler, arose a man of great zeal and unbridled energy, as well as the creative genius and a mystical imagination, Saul of Tarsus, known by his Roman name, Paul. Throughout his almost 500-page book, here, Kohler often refers to Christianity as the Pauline church, or refers to the Pauline dogmas believed by the church. The church is an institution separated with an entirely different set of beliefs than the Jesus of Nazareth. That's what Schweitzer and all of this has brought upon us. As an example of Pauline Christianity, Kohler says this of Paul. He, Paul, constructed a theological system far more pagan than Jewish in type, according to which man was corrupt through the sin of the first couple, and the death of Jesus on the cross was to be the atoning sacrifice offered by God Himself, who gave His own Son as a ransom for the sins of humanity. That this Jewish scholar just described Protestant Christianity. He has just summarized the Augustinian, Lutheran, and Calvinistic doctrines of original sin and substitutionary atonement. Kohler is not speaking about original Christianity. He is instead mistakenly saying it's first century. He is speaking instead about Western Protestant Christianity that came into existence not in the first century, but in 16th century Germany, Switzerland, and then Scotland, England, and finally the United States. The disconnect between Jesus and Paul, between the historical Jesus and the Christ of the church, is a disconnect and divide created by Western Christianity in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and continuing into the 21st centuries. This division has grown exponentially in the 20th century and is deeply rooted in the theological and religious departments of major public and private universities today. Wow. So, how about, that's what Judaism, the Jewish scholars, said about Christ and Paul in 1900. So, it's now the 21st century. What do Jews today, 100 years later, what is the Jewish understanding of Jesus and Paul today? Jesus, Jews in the 21st century. Contemporary Jewish scholar and theologian Daniel Boyarin represents a vanguard of contemporary Jewish scholars engaged in a re-examination of Jesus, Paul, and the church, their relationship to each other, and their relationship of each of those, Jesus, Paul, and the church, to Judaism. The opening words of Boyarin's A Radical Jew, Paul, and the Politics of Identity are startling. Let me read them to you. This book, by the way, it's a rather thick book, Paul and the Politics of Identity, A Radical Jew. He says at the beginning of the book, this book is the record of an encounter, his encounter, with some of the most remarkable text in the canon of Western literature, the letters of Paul. I am, Boyarin, a Talmudist and postmodern Jewish cultural critic who is reading Paul. I think that my particular perspective as a practicing Jewish non-Christian, critical but sympathetic reader of Paul conduces me to ways of understanding his work that are necessarily different from the ways of readers reading Paul who come from other cultural stances. Boyarin goes on to give two reasons for his interest in Paul as a late 20th, 21st century Jew. First of all, I would like to reclaim Pauline studies as an important, even an integral part of the study of Judaism in the Roman period and late antiquity. Paul has left us an extremely precious document for Jewish studies, the spiritual autobiography of a first century Jew. Second, I would like to reclaim Paul as an important Jewish thinker. On my reading of the Pauline corpus, Paul lived and died convinced that he was a Jew living out Judaism, living out the continuation of Israel. Paul then represents one option which Judaism could take in the first century. Paul represents a challenge to Jews, represented a challenge to Jews in the first century, and I will argue that Paul represents a challenge to Jews now as well. Boyarin's journey of re-examination of Paul, the radical Jew, as a Jew, led from his assessment of Paul, that was in 1994, to then an examination of the birth of Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity in the first centuries and late antiquities. His next book was published in 1999, Dying for God, Martyrdom and the Making of Christianity and Judaism. His next book, Martyrdom and the Making of Christianity and Judaism. In this second book, Boyarin discovers and now reports that the long-accepted story that Judaism preceded Christianity and had a mother-daughter relationship was absolutely incorrect. Judaism did not come first. Christianity did not come out of Judaism. Historical criticism, the understanding of history and the text, has to bring us, I'm quoting Boyarin in his second book, historical criticism has to bring us to the conclusion that early Christianity and the Judaism of the Mishnah are, in a manner of speaking, sister religions that were crystallized in the same period and the same background of enslavement and destruction. He is saying there's a difference in how they came about, who they are, but rather than there being Judaism, out of which Christianity came, that's baloney. He says, you have Israelite religion in Palestine, I'll just say Jerusalem, since that's where the temple was, and with the Romans and the apocalyptic fanaticism that led to that Jewish-Roman war and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, that all of the multiplicity of parties, if you will, the Essenes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Zealots, whoever else, that all of those, that after 70 AD, when the Romans have blown it all away, that out of this hodgepodge of Jewish Israelite thinking and believing, there will emerge two offspring. One is going to be Christianity, saying it is the continuation of Israelite and the faith of Abraham and the universality of God. The other is going to be rabbinic Judaism. This was Greek, so they could go. It was the coming out of one group here, Hellenistic Judaism. This one retreats inside Hebrew and an ethnic identity. He is saying both come out of Judaism. In this sense, or Israelite is the better way to phrase it, come out of this common Old Testament background this way, and therefore there is a relationship between the two, and we ought to be able to see what they share and what the differences are between the two. Understanding Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity as sisters then led Boyarin to look for the differences between the two and what caused their separation in his third book, The Borderlines and the Partition of Judeo-Christianity, how they began to be different and what those differences were here. Working his way backwards, you see, he started out with reading Paul and discovering who he was and recognized he was Jewish. He then goes to the differences between, is there a difference between Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism? How did they happen? And discovered they're not mother-daughter, but they're sisters. And so then he begins to look at how did they finally split? What caused the family feud between the sisters, if you will. So having had Paul and backwards and being here, Boyarin then in 2012 takes up the issue of Jesus himself in his book, The Jewish Gospels, the story of the Jewish Christ. He doesn't say Messiah. Notice he uses the Greek word, the story of the Jewish Christ. And in this book, Boyarin will now challenge the Jewish Christian stereotypes, the stereotypes that have been in existence ever since prior to Schweitzer and inside Judaism in Kohler, that has existed in Protestant Christianity at least since the 16th century. He now challenges the stereotypes, especially those of the historical quest movement. He says, while by now almost everyone, Christian and non-Christian, is happy enough to refer to Jesus the human as a Jew, I want to go a step beyond that. I wish us to see that Christ also, the divine Messiah, is a Jew. Christ is a Jew. Christology, or the early ideas about Christ, is also a Jewish discourse, and not until much later, an anti-Jewish discourse at all. Many Israelites, I'm still quoting Boyarin, many Israelites at the time of Jesus were expecting a Messiah who would be divine and come to earth in the form of a human. Thus, the basic underlying thoughts from which both the Trinity and the Incarnation grew are there in the very world into which Jesus was born and in which he was first written about in the Gospels of Mark and John. These startling findings of a shared cultural and theological history between Israelite religion in the first century and Christians suggest, according to Boyarin, that Christians and Jews will need to change their stories about each other. He says, on the one hand, Christians will no longer be able to claim that Jews willfully, as a body, all Jews, rejected Jesus as God. Many ancient Jews simply accepted Jesus as God, and they did so because their beliefs and expectations had led them to that place. Others, while holding similar ideas about God and a divine coming, found it hard to believe that this particular seemingly undistinguished Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, was the one that they were waiting for. They were not waiting for a political Messiah, not this group of Jews. They were waiting for a divine Messiah. The issue for them was, is it Jesus? There were other Jews waiting for a divine Messiah who said, it's him. On the other hand, Boyarin continues, Jews will have to stop vilifying Christian ideas about God as simply a collection of un-Jewish. This means the historical Jesus crowd's going to have to give them up too. Perhaps even pagan ideas, and in any case, bizarre fantasies. God in a human body, indeed, the Jews might say, recognizing these ideas now as deeply rooted in the ancient complex of Jewish religious ideas, may not lead us Jews to accept those ideas, but should certainly help us realize that Christian ideas are not alien to us. And sometimes, perhaps, those ideas are among the most ancient of all Israelite Jewish ideas. He continues, on the other hand, certain kinds of modern liberal Christian apologists, such as Philip Pullman, I'm not familiar with his writings, the author of his Dark Materials, will have to stop separating out a good Jesus from a bad Christ. The preacher down the road who wrote his book, Saving Jesus from the Church, will have to stop writing it. Will have to stop separating out a good Jesus from a bad Christ created by the church. I suggest that Jesus and Christ were one from the very beginning of the Jesus movement. It won't be possible any longer to think of some ethical religious teacher who was later promoted to divinity under the influence of alien Greek notions with his so-called original message being distorted and lost, and the ideas of Jesus as divine human Messiah goes back to the very beginning of the Christian movement. Goes back to Jesus himself and even before that. Wow. In Boyarin's section entitled How the Jews Came to Believe, how the Jews came to believe that Jesus was God, happened within the context of a broader debate about the origins of the divinity of Jesus. That is the debate in scholarship when was divinity ascribed to Jesus. It is known Jews of the first century believed the Messiah would be divine. This is not something added to Jesus as a non-Jewish addition from outside. If all the Jews, or even a substantial number in the first century, expected the Messiah would be divine as well as human, then the belief in Jesus as God is not the departure on which some new religion came into being, but simply another variant and not a deviant variant of Judaism. You get it? Here is a contemporary leading Jewish theologian, leading a vanguard of other Jewish theologians, going back, re-examining the birth of Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, and discovering, unlike the Christian theologians and former Jewish theologians, that in fact there is not historically inside Judaism and Christianity a division between, quote, a Jesus of Nazareth and the divine Christ of the church. Wow. It's not there inside Judaism. They're all wrong. Sorry, I get excited about this because when I went to university back in the middle, through the end of the 20th century, all of this stuff I'm talking about from Schweitzer on was the rage and the only thing being taught. Boyarin pointedly says, most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the first century and the beginning of the second century can safely be understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be the Judaism of that century. The ideas of Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germ of those ideas, were already present among Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to reincarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. The concept of the Trinity, the concept of incarnation were already existing inside Israelite religion in the first century when Christ was born. In his epilogue Boyarin summarizes his research this way: the New Testament is much more deeply embedded within Second Temple Jewish life and thought than many have imagined, even, and this I emphasize again, in the very moments that we take to be most characteristically Christian as opposed to Jewish. In those things we'd have to say, aha, that's definitely Christian and not Jewish. Even in those, the notion of a dual Godhead, for example, with a Father and a Son, the notion of a Redeemer who in himself will be both God and man, and the notion that this Redeemer would suffer and die as part of the salvational process. At least some of these ideas, Father, Son, Godhead, suffering Savior, have deep roots in the Hebrew Bible as well, and may be among some of the most ancient ideas about God and the world that the Israelite people ever held. Wow. Let us be clear. Boyarin does not say that Jesus is the Christ. He does say that the concept of a divine Christ is well within first century Jewish thinking and expectation. Whether one believed Jesus was that expected divine Christ Messiah was a matter of personal belief. From where then does this divide between the historical Jesus and the Christ of the church come? The notion of a division between Jesus and Christ is deeply embedded in 21st century thinking, Protestant thinking, and now secular thinking. It could be Jesus versus Paul, Jesus versus Hellenism, Jesus versus the church, Jesus of the Son of Man versus Son of God, Jesus versus the New Testament, Jesus versus Christianity. It matters little where one places the division. The issue is that a division is made at all. The division makers may argue among themselves between where to place the division. Regardless where they divide Jesus, they all agree there is a divide. This divide is true for Christian, secular, and Jewish scholars, as we saw with Kohler. They all believe there is a divide. After his investigation of the Gospels, from the textual and historical context within Second Temple Jewish thinking, Boyarin responds this way. The Jew responds this way, as it was recently put to me by an Orthodox Jewish scholar of rabbinics. The gospel story is a complete novelty engendered by the remarkable life and death of the man Jesus of Nazareth. That's the common conclusion. Boyarin responds, the historian in me rebels at such an account. I remind us that Daniel Boyarin is considered as one of the 2 or 3 greatest rabbinic scholars in the world, possibly even the greatest today. This is no insignificant judgment being given and given by an eminent Jewish scholar at that. Well, we've covered a lot of ground and went a little bit past our normal stopping time. Let's stop and take a brief break. There's a little bit left. We'll come back in just a minute and finish up for today. Be right back. Thanks. Well, welcome back. If we were to do, and we will not, do a historiographical study, the history of the writing of those claiming this division, that study would end up being a book in itself. But for our purposes, let us consider matters that we've already touched on. A cultural division of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a collection of ethnic and linguistic disparate regions held together by military force. One was not a Roman. One was a Thracian, a Macedonian, a Jew, an Egyptian, a Frank, or a Scot, or a Brit. There was no imperial, empire-wide citizenship and no imperial flag to which to pledge one's allegiance. The invisible idea of empire was made visible in the person of the emperor. Having no flag to salute, one worshipped the emperor. Religion in Rome was external and utilitarian. It was a duty one performed. There was within the Roman Empire, extending into the present century, our present century, a linguistic divide in the use of the term religion. For a Roman, religion did not imply personal faith and piety. Religion was not internal and invisible. It was external and visible. The adoption of the imperial cult and the worship of the emperor served a utilitarian and political need. In each newly conquered territory, provincial authorities encouraged the worship of the emperor as a means of bringing subjects to the loyal acceptance of a civilization imposed by conquest. The Romans were not missionaries preaching a new faith, but practical administrators molding new territories into loyal imperial provinces. Even among the soldiers, the imperial cult served to consolidate loyalty, and this purpose took precedence over all formal claims of religious orthodoxy. Religion was a patriotic duty to be practiced externally in public, not a private and personal spiritual experience or faith. Whether, in fact, emperor worship ever excited any great devotion is extremely doubtful. Roman religion was not internal, pietistic, and filled with personal devotion. But as a political device rather than a religious faith, the imperial cult provides an outstanding illustration of the Roman aptitude for successful government. So you see, there's one term, but two realities. The single term religion represented two different kinds of religion and religious experience. One was internal and experiential. The other was external and rational. One was invisible, while the other was visible. The divide over and within religion in the empire had begun. The eastern end of the Roman Empire understood religion experientially as a personal encounter with deity. The experience could not be reduced by an account of the experience. Life was ontological and experiential. It was a mystery to be encountered, not an external reality to be explained. Life as a mystery was mystical. The experience of the mystical was known as mysticism. The western end of the Roman Empire understood religion externally and politically. Its goal and its purpose were understandable and therefore explainable. Belief was not a mystical experience. Belief was an intellectual assent to the logic and purpose of the belief. It united the empire. Life was a system in the West to be systematically understood and intellectually acquired for the systematic ordering of one's own life. For the West, personal and experiential religion was messy, was chaotic, and disorderly. As the Catholic Cardinal Newman famously said, mysticism begins with mist and ends with schism. Well, like Moses on Mount Nebo representing Western culture, Cardinal Newman stood at the peak of 2,300 years of cultural history. 2,300 years ago, Plato had given birth to philosophy and its philosophical way of thinking. What for Plato had been a method, a special way of thinking, had soon become an end in itself, and the categories of logical thought were now regarded as capable of embracing the whole of reality. For Plato, mankind possessed two different means, faculties, two different modes or ways of knowing. The first is the natural and individual faculty of human reason, which achieves its knowledge by deducing it from certain preliminary assumptions, and this being but a relative and contingent knowledge. But also there was a second way of knowing. Plato called it noetic. It was supra-rational, above the normal way, empirical way of knowing. That was done by what he calls the nous, the intellect. You had the reason as one topic, one part, and the intellect as a separate organ for knowing, I guess. Organ's the wrong word. These were two separate faculties at work in us by which we apprehend and know our world. One of the faculties we called reason and was rational. The other was higher, above that, supra-rational. One was the knowledge of the physical. The other was the knowledge of the metaphysical. Aristotle, using Plato's philosophical method of thinking, began thinking about Plato's two faculties of knowing, the rational and the supra-rational. Though he wrote a book and invented the term metaphysics to be its title, Aristotle remained unconvinced in the existence of metaphysical reality and a metaphysical faculty of knowing that metaphysical reality. The major division within Greek thinking had begun. 300 years later, with the birth of the Roman Empire, the philosophical thinking of the Greeks now existed both in an exterior form, the visible, the physical, and the rationality of Aristotle, and the interior way of knowing, the metaphysical form of Plato. It was the exterior form that Rome inherited from Greece that would dominate what would become the Western rationalist world. It was within this historical, philosophical, and cultural context that divided the rational from the non-rational, that the claims of a division between Jesus of Nazareth and the Christ of Paul, between Jesus and the Gospels, and Jesus and the church occurred. It's that same division that understood Jesus in a physical, historical, and therefore any other understanding of Jesus as a metaphysical, supra-rational, non-rational understanding. From his position on rationalism, by the end of the 19th century, the non-rational, mystical Christianity was deemed non-existent inside Western Protestant Christianity. And so from his position of rationalism's Mount Nebo, Cardinal Newman could dismiss with disdain, as a Catholic, all non-rational ways of knowing. And so by the beginning of the 20th century, the term non-rational had become synonymous with irrational. The 20th century opened before Cardinal Newman, a century when the armies of rationalism would finally scale the walls of Constantinople and its mysticism. The 20th century would close 100 years after Cardinal Newman, that opened for Newman with the promise of the conquering by rationalism of an irrational world. That same 20th century would close with Nietzsche's madman's prophecy at long last coming to pass. Shouts of God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, welcomed the 21st century in which we now live. Nietzsche understood what Newman did not. The death of the non-rational, left only a corpse, a rational external conch shell, beautiful in its externality, but dead and lifeless all the same. Nietzsche knew what rational Christianity did not wish to know. Belief in the Christian God had become unbelievable inside of rationalism. Nietzsche and Cardinal Newman looked toward a 20th century about to dawn. For Ferdinand Mount, the 20th century had set. God's long funeral is over, and we are back where we started. 2,000 years of history have melted into the backstory which nobody reads anymore. We have returned to year 0 AD, AD 0, or rather 0 CE, because we are in the common era now, the years of our Lord having expired. So just how dead is dead? Nietzsche, who welcomed the death of God in culture, nonetheless cast a wary eye towards rationalism, which, stripped of its many arguments and seen for its naked self, science or scientism. Nietzsche argued as a scientist, as a believer in science, does not our faith in science make we scientists as pious as the pious? We're believers in science. Doesn't that make us a believer? What if, in the name of our scientific truth, like the Crusades and the Inquisition, or the wars fought over the Reformation, what if, in the name of truth at any price, in the name of our secular scientific truth, we have slaughtered one faith after another on this altar? What if, after we have slaughtered all the other half-truths, we are left with only the faith that truth exists? We scientists, we non-religious, we secularists, we believe truth exists. You will have gathered what I'm driving at, Nietzsche says, namely that it is still a mystical, metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests. That even we seekers after knowledge today, we godless anti-metaphysicians, still take our fire also from the flame lit by a faith that is thousands of years old, that Christian faith which was also the faith of Plato, that God is truth, that truth is divine. You see, what if the issue was not God versus science, nor faith versus reason? I say this, I'm not talking about someone refusing to wear their mask as an issue of politics or religion versus faith. Forget that silly war. Inside scientism, inside rationalism itself, scientism, a belief in truth, scientific truth, is a belief, it's a belief, and it is a belief in truth. It is a belief in the existence of truth, not an empirical, verifiable data, a belief in the existence of invisible reality truth. What if every system of thinking and every system of behavior was built on and predicated on the common belief that truth exists? What if all humanity worships at that same altar truth? What if there is, in fact, this is Nietzsche asking, no truth? What if the existence of truth itself should prove to be our most enduring lie? The darkness, the horror of no claim to truth opens the door for slaughter of all who disagree with us, because there is no truth to win after all. Nietzsche not only foresaw the coming of the 20th, he also anticipated the foreboding of the 21st century. A century that began with munchkins celebrating across the land, ding dong, the witch is dead, witch oh witch, the wicked witch, ding dong, the wicked witch is dead. In the name of the new truth, the old gods are cast out, the old rules are gone. It is a brave new world without any real sense of involvement, and above all, without any worry and fear for ourselves. We do not notice the threatening shadows on the horizon. Out with the old, in with the new. Down is now up, out is now in, black is white. The emperor has a new set of clothes. By the way, these words that I'm sharing were written many weeks ago, and I must say, for the sake of not being incorrectly understood, I am not making a political comment on anything current. I am not here politicizing the apocalypse. The apocalypse stands for itself. We are commenting on the larger scope of culture, the larger scope of history, within which our brief moment happens. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. It is within that scope, the scope of that dream, that Daniel has, that is the last book in the Septuagint, the Hebrew Old Testament, coming out of Alexandria, with the New Testament coming immediately on the next page. It is with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's dream that we began back in September this journey together through the apocalypse. And it is with that dream And that beginning, we now come to a close on, not quite to a close, the beginning of the close of our first chapter of part 3, the mystagogic apocalypse. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Kingdom after kingdom and empire after empire replaced one another. Governments come and go. One age follows another. A generation comes and a generation goes. What has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. It may seem like Friday, but Sunday is on its way. In 1910, Albert Schweitzer wrote his Quest for the Historical Jesus, and the opening shot of the rational wars began in the 20th century. Schweitzer wrote his follow-up book on Paul in 1928, 29, 30. Rather than painting Paul as the culprit that Hellenized the church and divided Jesus from the Christ of the church, Schweitzer understood Paul within the eschatology associated with Jesus. Schweitzer's quest launched the battles of the 20th century. His mysticism of Paul, quietly ignored and politely was left on the shelf, did not impact the 20th century. In the last decade of the 20th century, Schweitzer's mysticism of Paul was reissued. This is a copy of the reissue at the end of the 20th century, reissued. In the foreword, Yaroslav Pelikan welcomed the reissue, which came nearly at the same time as the revised new edition of a different book, another book, Callistos Wears the Orthodox Church. Pelikan saw the reissue of both as symbolic of its usefulness, of Schweitzer's book as being useful to those of us who are adherents of the Orthodox tradition. I should remind you that Yaroslav Pelikan, at the time he wrote this foreword, and at the time of his life up until his death, he was the leading scholar on Martin Luther in the 20th century in the world. He had become an Orthodox Christian near the end of his life. In his foreword to Schweitzer's book on Paul, Yaroslav Pelikan acknowledged not only the existence of the Orthodox faith, but that he was an Orthodox Christian. In between Schweitzer's quest and the mysticism of Paul and the reissue of mysticism of Paul 70 years later, in between the first issue of, wherever I put it now, I don't need it, it doesn't matter, but in between the historical quest for the historical Jesus and the reissue, 70 years between here and here, this book helped launch the attacks on Christianity and the assault of rationalism on the experiential, mystical side of our faith. A division, by the way, that Boyarin, in all of his books, now says is a false division if we understand Judaism correctly. We have in between this book and this book, something has happened. Something has happened in the United States, inside Canada, Western Europe, South America, and Australia. At the end of World War I, millions of Orthodox Christians fled the Middle East and Eastern Europe with the defeat of the Turkish Empire or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The immigrants got jobs, sent their children to school, and built churches for themselves. By the 1970s, most of these Orthodox parishes had begun switching from their native language and had now begun to use here in the United States English, and in other countries the new language of that country. And by the late 1980s, non-ethnic Americans, non-ethnic Canadians, Australians, Chileans, wherever, began discovering the Orthodox faith that was now existing within their countries. And these non-ethnics began to be received into the church and were becoming Orthodox Christians the same way Yaroslav Pelikan had. So simultaneous to the story of the death of God and the battles and victories of rationalism in the 20th century, the story of the church in the book of Acts quietly was being lived out in the 20th century. Now there were those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to no one but the Jews only. These ethnic parishes, preaching the word to only themselves, soon found themselves preaching the word here in the United States to Heinz 57 Americans, preaching the word in Europe, Canada, Chile, Australia, preaching the word to their now adopted countrymen as well. The message of the apocalypse is clear: fear not, overcome. Elijah the prophet once faced a time such as ours. His world was collapsing around him. The people had forsaken God's covenant. They had torn down the holy altars and had killed the clergy. Elijah believed he was the only one left, and they sought for his life. In the midst of despair and woe is me, God tells Elijah that he has 7,000 who have not bowed their knees to Baal, whose mouth has not kissed him. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, reminds them of this moment in Elijah's life And then Paul says, even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant of believers. Fear not. At this very moment, there is a remnant scattered across the globe, across the United States, Canada, and North America, Mexico and the islands of the Caribbean, South America, Australia, England, Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Romania, Eastern Europe, Egypt, the Middle East, the islands of the Indian Ocean, Egypt, Greece, the Greek islands, Russia, and the Ukraine. Under our radar and unknown to us, for example, there is a remnant, not a die-hard hanging on by the skin of their teeth, dwindling, almost dead, and barely alive remnant. Across the globe at this present time, there is a vibrant, thriving, and alive, bursting with life remnant in all the countries I have named, as well as the many I have not. For example, at this present time, unknown to us and below our radar, there are 60 Orthodox parishes in the mountains and valleys of Switzerland. While the empirical New World Empire is busy celebrating its cultural victory with its funeral of God, the uncut stone of Nebuchadnezzar's dream is quietly striking its empirical feet as the mystagogic gospel, with the mystagogical gospel reducing its rationalistic toes and feet to powder. Fear not, this new empire, it too has feet of clay. Whether it's a year, 100 years, or 1,000 years in coming, it has feet of clay. Fear not. The uncut stone is already at work. Amen. Well, God bless you for being with us as we've started now and concluded our first chapter in the third section of our looking at the Apocalypse, the mystagogic chapter, and the mystagogic section, rather, that we're now in. I look forward, God willing, to be with you again next week as we continue this final section together. Thanks. I'll see you next week.